Retiring off passive income is entirely possible. The math works, the historical data supports it, and thousands of people have done it successfully. But the popular version of how it works, the version you have heard repeated in 100 YouTube videos and 1,000 Instagram captions, is missing the parts that actually determine whether you stay retired or go back to work within 3 years. The fantasy is simple and seductive. You accumulate a pile of money. You invest it in something that pays you regularly. Dividends from a stock portfolio, rent checks from a few properties, interest from a bond ladder, royalties from a book you wrote 5 years ago. The checks arrive every month or every quarter. You never touch the principal. The pile sits there forever, a golden goose that never ages and never dies, and you spend the rest of your life doing whatever you want. That fantasy has put more retirees back into the workforce than any market crash ever has. Not because the math is wrong, because the version of the math that gets shared online is the clean, averaged, smoothed-over version. The version where inflation is a footnote, where markets go up every year by exactly 7%, where rental properties never need a new roof, where dividends are never cut, and where your spending habits stay frozen in time like a photograph. The real version is messier. It has sequence risk that can destroy a portfolio in the first 3 years. It has hidden costs that turn quote-unquote passive income into a second job. It has inflation that compounds silently while you look at a balance that never changes. And it has a psychological dimension that nobody warns you about until the first time you watch your net worth drop by $100,000 in a month and realize that your grocery money just came from selling stocks at the worst possible moment. Today, I want to walk you through the real math of retiring off passive income, not the Instagram version, not the 4% rule scrawled on a cocktail napkin, the version that accounts for inflation, sequence risk, the hidden costs of supposedly passive assets, and the psychology of watching your only source of income fluctuate by thousands of dollars a month while you try to sleep. Because if you build this wrong, you do not just lose some money or delay a vacation, you lose the ability to not work. And at 65, losing that is not a setback. It is a life sentence. Your investments can recover from a bad year. Your career cannot recover from a decade out of the workforce. Before we get into the numbers, I want to make sure you know what kind of video this is. This is not a motivation video. This is not one of those videos where I tell you that you can retire at 35 if you just skip the avocado toast and start a dropshipping business. Those videos are designed to make you feel excited for 8 minutes and then anxious for the next 48 hours. This is a math video that happens to be about freedom. Every claim I make in this video is backed by a number I am going to show you. If that sounds like the kind of content you want more of, subscribe. It is free, and it is the most asymmetrically beneficial transaction you will make all day. Now, let us start with a definition, because the term passive income has been stretched to the point of meaninglessness. When people say they want to retire off passive income, they usually mean one of two things. Either they want an asset to generate cash that covers their bills without ever selling the asset itself. This is the dividend stock, the rental property, the bond ladder, the royalty stream, the golden goose model. You own the goose, you spend the eggs, the goose lives forever, and your children inherit it. Or they want a total return approach, where they sell small pieces of a growing portfolio over time. This is the index fund model. You own a diversified basket of stocks and bonds. They appreciate at roughly 7 to 10% a year on average. You sell roughly 3 to 4% a year to fund your life. The remaining growth compounds. The math works because the growth rate exceeds the withdrawal rate over long periods. Most people pick one of these two camps and argue about which is superior. The dividend people say you should never sell your principal. The total return people say dividends are just forced sales in disguise. Both sides are partly right and completely tedious. The people who actually stay retired tend to use both. They have a core portfolio of broad market index funds for long-term growth and inflation protection. They layer in some cash flow assets, real estate, bonds, dividend stocks, to cover the essential bills. They keep a cash buffer of 1 to 3 years of expenses for emergencies and bad markets. The cash flow covers the lights and the groceries. The total return portfolio funds the rest of life. The cash buffer acts as a shock absorber. If one engine stalls, the other two keep running. That is the architecture. 3 legs, none of them sufficient alone. All of them together sufficient to survive almost anything. Now let us test each piece of it, starting with the piece that gets quoted the most and understood the least. If you have spent any time in the financial independence space, you have encountered the 4% rule. It comes from a study published by a financial planner named William Bengen in 1994, the Journal of Financial Planning, not a blog post, not a Twitter thread. Bengen analyzed historical market data going back to 1926, covering the Great Depression, World War II, the stagflation of the 1970s, the crash of 1987. He concluded that if you withdraw 4% of your portfolio in the first year of retirement, then adjust that dollar amount for inflation every year after, your money would have survived every 30-year retirement period in modern American history, even the worst starting years, even 1929, when the market dropped 89%, even 1966, when stocks went nowhere for 16 years and inflation averaged over 6%. The 4% rule survived them all. The inverse of 4% is 25. That gives you the clean napkin math that every personal finance influencer has tattooed on their brain. Multiply your annual spending by 25. That is your number. That is the amount you need invested before you can quit. Spend $40,000 a year. You need $1 million. Spend $60,000. You need $1.5 million. Spend $100,000. You need $2.5 million. It is elegant. It is memorable. It gives you a target, and it is dangerously incomplete. Not because Bengen was wrong. He was not wrong. He was doing research on a specific question with specific assumptions. The problem is that the internet stripped away all of those assumptions and turned it into a law of physics. Here is what the internet version leaves out. First, Bengen assumed a retirement lasting 30 years. That is a reasonable assumption for someone retiring at 65. It is not reasonable for someone retiring at 45 or 50. If you are planning to retire early, you are looking at a 40 or 50-year horizon. The 4% rule was never tested against timelines that long. When researchers have tested it against 50-year periods, the success rate drops. Not to zero, but from roughly 95% to something closer to 85% for a 60-40 portfolio. That means roughly 1 in 7 early retirees following the 4% rule blindly runs out of money. 1 in 7 is not a rounding error. It is Russian roulette with your retirement. Second, Bengen assumed a portfolio composed of large-cap U.S. stocks and intermediate-term government bonds. He did not test other allocations. He did not test international diversification. He did not test alternative assets. If your portfolio looks different from his test portfolio, the 4% rule was not calibrated for you. Third, and this is the one that matters most right now, Bengen used historical data. Past returns. What actually happened? But we invest forward, not backward. Forward-looking return estimates from institutions like Morningstar and Vanguard currently project lower returns over the next decade than the historical average. Lower returns mean a lower safe withdrawal rate. Morningstar's own research, published in 2024, suggested that a safe starting withdrawal rate in the current valuation environment might be closer to 3.3 or 3.5%, not 4. Let me show you what that gap means in real terms. If you spend $40,000 a year and the safe withdrawal rate is 4%, you need $1 million. If the safe withdrawal rate is 3.3%, you need $1.21 million. That extra $210,000 is not a rounding error. It is 5 additional years of working and saving for someone earning a good salary and saving 20% of it. 5 years of your life. 5 years of mornings waking up to an alarm clock. 5 years of sitting in meetings and commuting and waiting for Friday, all because a decimal point moved by 0.7%. Nobody mentions that in the videos with the Lamborghini thumbnails, and we have not even touched inflation yet. The 4% rule adjusts for inflation in the withdrawal amount. $40,000 in year 1 becomes $41,200 in year 2 if inflation is 3%. That adjustment is built into the math and it is essential. Without it, your purchasing power halves in about 25 years. But here is what the adjustment misses. The Consumer Price Index is an average of spending across all Americans. Your personal inflation rate is almost certainly different. If you own your home with a fixed-rate mortgage, your housing costs are more stable than the CPI suggests. If you rent in a growing city, Your housing costs probably rise faster than the CPI. If you have significant healthcare expenses, and almost every retiree eventually will, those costs have historically risen at roughly twice the rate of general inflation. Prescription drugs, long-term care insurance, Medicare premiums, out-of-pocket medical costs. These are not luxuries. They are expenses that become more central to your budget as you age, and they inflate faster than the number that the 4% rule uses to adjust your withdrawals. Your actual personal inflation rate might be 5%, while the CPI reports 3%. Over 20 years, a 2% annual gap between what the rule gives you and what life actually costs compounds into a shortfall of roughly 40% in your purchasing power. The math is cruel. It does not announce itself. It just shows up one day when you realize the money that used to cover a comfortable month now barely covers 3 weeks. The protocol here is not to abandon the 4% rule entirely. It still tells you something useful. It tells you the historical baseline, what actually happened in the worst periods of American financial history. That is valuable information. The protocol is to treat it as a starting point, not a guarantee. Build your plan around 3.3 or 3.5%. If the market delivers 4% returns, you are pleasantly surprised. If it delivers less, your plan still works. Design your budget so that your essential living expenses, housing, food, healthcare, insurance, sit comfortably inside a 3% withdrawal rate. The extra 1% covers the things that make life worth living: travel, gifts, restaurants, the grandkids. If the market cooperates, you spend the extra. If the market does not cooperate, you skip the cruise this year, and you still pay the electric bill. That is not deprivation. That is engineering. You have built a system where a bad market year means you vacation locally instead of flying to Europe. That is a system that survives. Flexibility is worth more than an extra $100,000 in your portfolio. A retiree who can reduce their spending by 20% during a market downturn has effectively increased their safe withdrawal rate by a full percentage point without saving an extra dollar. The numbers do not care how you feel about that, but your ability to sleep through a bear market depends entirely on whether you have built that flexibility into your plan before the bear market arrives. Now, at this point, you might be thinking that the solution to all of this is obvious. Do not sell stocks. Do not rely on withdrawals at all. Just build a pure cash flow machine. Dividends from blue chip companies. Rent checks from a portfolio of properties. Interest from a bond ladder. Quarterly distributions from a real estate investment trust. Money that just shows up in your account without you having to liquidate a single share. That is the real passive income. That is what actually feels safe, because you never see your principal decline. You just see deposits every quarter like clockwork. And you are right that it feels safe. That feeling of safety is the most expensive financial product ever sold. The cash flow model is what almost everyone pictures when they first start dreaming about passive income. You own 10 rental properties. Each one is a modest single-family home in a decent neighborhood. Each one nets you $400 a month after the mortgage. 10 properties times $400 is $4,000 a month. $48,000 a year. That is a middle-class income in much of America, generated entirely by assets you own. You never touch the principal. In fact, the principal is growing. The properties are appreciating at 3 to 5% a year. The rents are rising with inflation. Your tenants are paying down your mortgages. In 20 years, when the mortgages are gone, those properties net you $1,000 a month each instead of $400. Someone else is building your wealth for you while you sleep. It is a beautiful machine, and it is about as passive as a puppy. Let me walk you through the actual numbers on a single rental property, because most people have never seen them laid out honestly by someone who is not trying to sell them a course. You buy a duplex in a mid-sized Midwestern city for $280,000. You put 20% down. That is $56,000 of your own money. You finance the remaining $224,000 at 6.5% over 30 years. Your monthly mortgage payment, including property taxes and insurance escrow, is roughly $1,850. Each unit rents for $1,400 a month. Your gross scheduled rent is $2,800 a month, $33,600 a year. You look at $2,800 coming in and $1,850 going out, and you think you are making $950 a month in passive income. That is $11,400 a year a 20% annual cash-on-cash return on your $56,000 investment. It looks like a home run. Now let me subtract the things that every landlord pays, but nobody puts in the Instagram post. The property manager takes 8 to 10% of gross rent. On $2,800, that is roughly $250 a month. Some landlords self-manage to save this cost. If you self-manage, you are not passive. You are now a property manager. You are the person who gets called at 11 p.m. on a Saturday because a toilet is overflowing into the downstairs unit. You are the person who has to find a plumber on a holiday weekend and pay the emergency rate. You cannot value your own time at zero and still call yourself retired. The vacancy rate for a well-located property in a stable market averages about 6% annually. That is roughly one unit empty for about 3 weeks a year between tenants. During that time, you are not collecting rent, but you are still paying the mortgage, the taxes, the insurance, the utilities. On a $2,800 property, 6% vacancy costs you about $1,700 a year in lost rent. Maintenance and repairs on a residential property average roughly 1% of the property value per year. That is $2,800 a year on a $280,000 property. Some years, you spend nothing. Some years the HVAC dies and you spend $8,000. The average is what matters for planning, and the average is roughly $3,000. Capital expenditures are separate from maintenance. The roof will need replacing roughly every 22 years. On a duplex, that is about $12,000. Set aside $500 a year for that. The water heater will last about 12 years. Set aside $150 a year. The appliances in 2 units, stove, refrigerator, dishwasher, washer, dryer, will cycle over roughly 10 to 15 years. Set aside another $300 a year. The flooring and paint between tenants, another $400 a year. The driveway repaving every 20 years, another $200 annually. Add it all up. Property management, $2,500 a year. Vacancy, $1,700. Maintenance, $2,800. Capital expenditure reserves, $1,500. Your actual net operating income, the real number, is roughly $33,600 minus $1,850 times 12 for the mortgage, minus all of those expenses. That comes to about $430 a month, $5,160 a year. That is your passive income from a $56,000 investment, a 9.2% annual return, which is excellent. Genuinely, it is better than the stock market's long-term average if you include the appreciation and the mortgage paydown. But it is not passive. It is a part-time job that pays 9%. And to replace a $40,000 salary with this level of net rental income, you would need roughly 8 such properties, all performing at this level, all with the same down payment requirements. 8 times $56,000 is $448,000. That is the capital required, and you would be managing a small apartment complex worth over $2 million. That is not retirement. That is a career change. The same logic applies to dividend investing, though the traps wear different costumes. A stock that pays a 7% dividend yield looks like free money on a screen. 7% on $1 million is $70,000 a year without ever selling a share. But you have to ask why the yield is 7% when the market average is closer to 1.5%. Sometimes the answer is that the company is a mature, cash-generating utility or telecommunications firm that pays out most of its earnings as dividends because it has limited growth opportunities. That is a legitimate business model. AT&T did this for decades, though they eventually cut the dividend. More often, especially when you see yields above 5 or 6%, the yield is high because the stock price has collapsed. The company is in trouble. The market has priced in a probability that the dividend will be cut or eliminated entirely. The high yield is not a promise of income. It is a warning sign, dressed as an opportunity. And even when the company is healthy, a high dividend payout ratio means the company is returning cash to shareholders instead of reinvesting in growth over a 30-year retirement. That matters. A company that reinvests earnings into new products, new markets, acquisitions, is a company whose stock price compounds. A company that pays out everything it earns is a company whose stock price stays roughly flat while you collect the dividend. Both are valid strategies, but the total return from the growth company, dividends plus capital appreciation, has historically exceeded the total return from the high dividend payer over long periods. You are trading growth for income, and you need to understand the price of that trade. The solution is not to avoid cash flow assets. It is to understand their actual role in a retirement portfolio. They are not the engine. They are the suspension. They smooth the ride. They reduce the pressure on your portfolio by covering a baseline of expenses. If your rental income or dividends or bond interest reliably covers your property taxes, your utilities, your groceries, and your health insurance, then a 30% stock market downturn does not force you to sell a single share. Your life continues unchanged. Your index funds sit untouched. The market recovers, as it always has within a few years, and your portfolio is larger at the end of the recovery than it was before the crash, because you never sold anything at the bottom. That is the hybrid model, a core portfolio of broad market index funds for long-term growth and inflation protection, a layer of cash flow assets, real estate, dividend stocks, bonds, to cover the essential expenses, a cash cushion of 1 to 3 years of living expenses for the truly bad years, 3 legs of a stool. No single leg carries all the weight. All 3 together create something that can survive almost anything the market or the economy can do. Now let me talk about the variable that most financial independence content skips, because it is not exciting and it does not sell courses: your spending rate. Your expenses are the single most powerful lever in the entire retirement equation. More powerful than your investment returns. More powerful than your savings rate during accumulation. More powerful than whether you get 5% or 7% on your portfolio. The reason is simple: arithmetic. Under the 4% rule, every dollar of annual spending requires $25 of invested capital to support it for a 30-year retirement. Under a more conservative 3.3% rule, every dollar of annual spending requires $30 of invested capital permanently. This is not a metaphor. This is the inverse of the withdrawal rate. A $4 daily coffee habit costs roughly $1,460 a year. To fund that habit from passive income indefinitely, you need between $36,000 and $44,000 of additional invested capital, depending on your withdrawal rate, not $36,000 of income over your lifetime. $36,000 that you have to accumulate, invest, and never spend the principal of. A car payment of $450 a month costs $5,400 a year. That is $135,000 to $162,000 of required capital just to sustain a single expense. A vacation budget of $5,000 a year requires $125,000 to $150,000 of dedicated capital. When you look at your monthly budget through this lens, every line item becomes a freedom decision. The streaming services, the upgraded phone plan, the meal delivery subscription, the gym membership you barely use. These are not $15 or $30 or $50 monthly decisions. They are capital allocation decisions measured in the tens of thousands of dollars. The person who cuts their annual spending from $65,000 to $50,000 has not just saved $15,000. They have reduced their freedom number by $375,000 to $450,000. They have given themselves 4 to 6 years of their life back. No amount of investment optimization can produce that result. You cannot tweak your asset allocation enough to generate the equivalent of cutting your expenses by $15,000 a year. The expense side is simply more powerful. A useful way to track your progress without obsessing over a single giant number is something I call the coverage ratio. It is a simple fraction. Take your total passive income from all sources: dividends, net rental income, bond interest, royalty payments, anything that arrives in your account without you selling an asset. Divide that by your annual spending. If you spend $50,000 a year and have $12,500 in passive income, your coverage ratio is 25%. You are a quarter of the way to your essential expenses being covered without touching your portfolio. What is interesting about the coverage ratio is that the psychological benefits are not linear. The first 25% is the hardest to accumulate and the most transformative once you reach it. When your passive income covers your rent or mortgage, the largest single line item in most budgets, your relationship with your job changes completely. The fear of losing your job goes from existential to manageable. You do not need the full 100% to feel the effects. At 30% coverage, you can take a lower-paying job that does not destroy your health. At 50% coverage, you can go part-time and still meet all your obligations. At 75%, you can quit and figure out the rest over the following year, consulting or freelancing enough to cover the gap while your portfolio continues compounding. Every increment of coverage buys you an increment of freedom. That framing is more useful than a single distant number because it gives you milestones you can feel before you cross the finish line. The trap on the spending side is the moving goalpost. I have watched people hit their original freedom number and immediately decide it was insufficient. They had 500,000 and decided they needed 750. They had 750 and decided they needed $1 million. They hit $1 million and suddenly needed 2 because their lifestyle had expanded in lockstep with their net worth. The nicer car, the bigger house, the more expensive vacations, the private school for the kids. Each upgrade was individually reasonable. Each one was something they could afford given their income. Together, they pushed the freedom number so far into the future that it became unreachable. That is not a financial problem. That is a contentment problem wearing a spreadsheet costume. If your expenses rise at the same rate as your passive income, your coverage ratio never improves. The ratio is 0 divided by 0. It does not move. You are running faster on a treadmill that is accelerating underneath you. The people who actually retire and stay retired are the ones who can define what enough looks like, write it down, and then defend that definition against their own ambition, against the marketing machine that wants them to upgrade, against the friends with the nicer houses and the newer cars. Ambition is an asset during the accumulation phase. It is what makes you work harder and earn more and save more. It is a liability during the distribution phase because it prevents you from ever arriving. The person who needs 10 million to feel safe will never feel safe. The person who needs 40,000 to feel free is already free as soon as the math works. The difference is not in the portfolio size. It is in the definition of enough. Let us talk about the thing that scares me more than any market crash, more than any dividend cut, more than any vacancy rate. Sequence of returns, risk. This is the mathematical reason that people who do everything right, save diligently for 30 years, invest in low-cost index funds, quit their jobs with a portfolio that looks fully funded on paper, can still find themselves applying for a job at Walmart at age 68. It has nothing to do with how much they saved. It has nothing to do with what they invested in. It has everything to do with what the market did in the first 3 to 5 years after they stopped working. Sequence risk is the fact that the order of your investment returns matters as much as the average. If you retire with $1 million and the market rises 10% a year for the first 5 years, you are essentially bulletproof. Your portfolio grows faster than your withdrawals deplete it. The compounding engine is running at maximum power during the most sensitive period. You emerge from the first 5 years with more money than you started with, despite having spent $180,000 along the way. Your retirement is effectively funded forever. Now imagine the same person, same $1 million, same spending, different market. Year 1, the market drops 18%. A bad year but not a crash. Your portfolio is now worth $820,000, but you still have living expenses. You withdraw $40,000 plus maybe 3% more for inflation. Your portfolio is now at $778,000. Year 2, the market falls another 12%. Your portfolio drops to roughly $685,000. You withdraw another $41,000. You are now at $644,000. In 24 months, you have lost over a third of your wealth. Not because you invested poorly, not because you spent too much, because the market had bad timing. To recover from $644,000 back to $1 million, you need a 55% gain. The market eventually delivers that gain. It always has historically, but it might take 4 or 5 years. During those 4 or 5 years, you are still withdrawing $40,000 a year to live, another $160,000 to $200,000 removed from a portfolio that is trying to recover. Every withdrawal at depressed prices locks in a little more of the loss permanently. The shares you sold at the bottom to buy groceries are gone. They do not participate in the rebound. Even when the market eventually hits a new all-time high, your portfolio never fully recovers because the recovery is happening on a smaller base of shares. That is the permanent damage. It cannot be undone by a raging bull market. It can only be prevented by never selling at the bottom in the first place. The psychological dimension of sequence risk is almost more dangerous than the math. When you watch your life savings drop by $150,000 in a year, The fear is not intellectual. It is not the calm actuarial concern that you might run out of money in 25 years. It is the visceral, physical fear that you have made an irreversible mistake, that you are going to be the cautionary tale, that you are going to have to call your old boss and ask for your job back at an age when nobody wants to hire you, that your spouse is going to look at you across the dinner table and you are going to see the question they are too kind to verbalize. Did we make a mistake? Should you go back to work? What happens if this keeps going? That fear makes people do things that destroy their financial futures. They sell everything and move to cash. They lock in the losses permanently. They trade a temporary paper decline for a permanent real one, and then they spend the next decade watching the market recover without them while their cash sits in a savings account, earning 0.5%. The people who survive sequence risk are not the ones with the highest IQ. They are not the ones with the most sophisticated asset allocation. They are the ones who understood that bear markets are not anomalies. They are features of the system. The market falls 20% or more roughly once every 6 years. A 30-year retirement will contain 4 or 5 bear markets. Some of them will be garden variety corrections that recover within 18 months. Some will be the 2008 kind that take 4 or 5 years to fully recover. You will live through all of them. You do not get to opt out. You only get to prepare psychologically and financially before they arrive, so that when they arrive, you follow your plan instead of your panic. The protocol for sequence risk is the cash buffer. It is the least sophisticated strategy in all of finance, and it is the one that saves more retirements than every fancy hedging strategy combined. The idea is almost embarrassingly simple. Keep 12 to 36 months of living expenses in actual cash or cash equivalents, a high-yield savings account, short-term treasury bills, a money market fund. When the market crashes in the first year of your retirement, you do not sell a single share of stock. You do not even log into your brokerage account if you can help it. You live off the cash. You pay your mortgage, your groceries, your electric bill, your property taxes, everything from the cash buffer. Your portfolio sits untouched. The market recovers, as it always has within 3 to 5 years historically. Once it has recovered, you replenish the cash buffer by selling shares at the new higher prices. You sold nothing at the bottom. You sold at the recovery. That is the entire strategy. It requires no market timing. It requires no prediction. It requires only the discipline to not panic and the liquidity to not need to. The cost of holding that much cash is the opportunity cost of not having it invested. On $1 million portfolio, keeping $40,000 in cash earning 3%, while the market earns 7%, means you are losing roughly $1,600 a year in foregone returns. That is real money. Over 30 years, compounded, it is significant, but it is insurance, and insurance always costs something. You buy it not because you expect to use it, but because the thing you are insuring against, going broke at 75, is infinitely worse than the premium. The cash buffer does not eliminate sequence risk. It gives you a shock absorber. It buys you time, and time is the only thing that makes the math work. Given enough time without forced selling at the bottom, the historical pattern reasserts itself. Markets recover, compounding resumes. Your portfolio survives. The people who ran out of money did not run out because the 4% rule failed. They ran out because they were forced to sell into a downturn, and those sold shares never came back. There is one more trap in this equation, and it is the one that appears in zero spreadsheets. What happens to your mind when you actually stop working? Not your bank account, your identity. The reason so many people who achieve financial independence go back to work within 2 years is not that the math failed them. It is that they never prepared for what life looks like when nobody requires them to be anywhere at any specific time. Work provides 4 things that are not on your pay stub: structure, the rhythm of a day with a beginning and an end; status, a role in society that answers the question, what do you do? Community, casual social contact with people who are not your spouse or your children; and utility, the feeling that you solved a problem and someone else needed it solved. When you retire, you lose all 4 at the same moment. A week of unstructured time feels like vacation. A month feels like disorientation. 6 months feels like you are drifting. A year feels like a crisis of meaning. I have watched early retirees spiral into depression, not because they missed the work, but because they missed being useful. They missed the feeling of competence. They missed the part of their day where someone said thank you and meant it. These are not small things. They are foundational psychological needs that a 40-hour work week provides, whether you like your job or not. If your retirement plan does not account for them, the portfolio can be perfectly constructed and you will still be miserable. There is a useful distinction in the financial independence community between retiring from something and retiring to something. The people who retire from a job they hate, with nothing on the other side except the absence of that job, tend to crash. They have escaped a negative, but they have not built a positive. The absence of misery is not the same as the presence of fulfillment. The people who retire to a specific version of life tend to thrive. They have a project they have been waiting to start. They have a skill they want to teach. They have a cause they want to volunteer for. They have grandchildren they want to be present for in a way their career never allowed. The portfolio size is the same in both scenarios. The outcome is completely different. The people who do this most successfully do not actually stop working entirely. They stop doing work that drains them. They shift to optional work. They consult when a project interests them. They sit on a board. They mentor young people in their field. They take on commission work in a creative discipline they have loved since they were 20. They say no to everything that does not excite them because they can. The goal of passive income is not a lifetime of leisure. Leisure becomes boring faster than anyone admits. The goal is complete autonomy over what you do with your time and who you do it for. That distinction changes the math. You do not need enough passive income to fund 40 years of doing nothing. You need enough to fund a baseline of survival so that every dollar you earn from optional work is a bonus. The survival number is much smaller than the luxury number. And once you accept that you will probably always do something that generates some income, just on your own terms, the freedom number becomes more achievable and the retirement becomes more sustainable. So, where does this leave us? Retiring off passive income is real, but the popular version of it is missing every important detail. The 4% rule is a historical observation, not a law of physics. Build your plan around 3.3 to 3.5%. The cash flow model is powerful, but it is not passive. Treat rental properties and dividend stocks as stabilizers, not as the entire engine. Your spending rate is more powerful than your return rate. Every dollar you permanently cut from your budget reduces your required portfolio by $25 to $30. Sequence risk is the invisible killer that turns a fully funded retirement into a crisis in 24 months of bad market timing. A cash buffer of 1 to 3 years of expenses is the cheapest insurance you will ever buy against it. And the psychology of retirement matters as much as the math. Design the life before you design the portfolio. Retire to something meaningful, not just from something painful. The freedom number for a life of purposeful optional work is lower than the freedom number for a life of permanent vacation. And most importantly, build this system while you are still working so that it is already in place, already tested, already providing some income. Before the day you hand in your notice, the worst time to discover that your passive income assumptions were wrong is the first month after your last paycheck. Here is what I want you to do right now. Open a note on your phone or grab a piece of paper. Write down your current annual spending. All of it. The bills, the subscriptions, the groceries, the insurance, the occasional splurges. Multiply that number by 30 for a conservative 3.3% withdrawal rate, or by 25 for the standard 4%. That is your freedom number, your target. Now write down your current passive income from all sources: interest, dividends, net rental income, side income that requires less than 5 hours a month. Divide that by your annual spending. That is your coverage ratio, a percentage. Look at both numbers. The freedom number tells you how far you still have to travel. The coverage ratio tells you how much ground you have already covered. Most people ignore the second number entirely. They stare at the gap and feel hopeless. But the coverage ratio is the number that actually changes how you feel tomorrow morning when your alarm goes off. At 10%, you feel a small sense of possibility. At 25%, you feel the first real taste of leverage over your employer. At 50%, you feel an independence that most people never experience in their entire working lives. You do not need 100% to feel the benefits. You just need forward progress. If this was useful, hit the like button so the algorithm knows to show it to more people who need to see the real math. Let me know your coverage ratio in the comments, not your net worth, not your salary, just the percentage of your expenses that passive income currently covers. Those comments are going to be more honest than any forum thread you have ever read. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.